It's a celebration of Marxist-Leninism in what could soon be the world's top capitalist power. Yes, communism is alive and well and living in China, where the party partied this Thursday to mark its centenary birthday. Much of those 100 years were indeed a struggle and a bloody one at times. But for 3 decades now, the planet's most populous nation has gone from strength to strength. To employ the phrase favored in Beijing, what does socialism with Chinese characteristics look like these days, particularly under the strongest ruler since Mao? What does Xi Jinping mean when he tells a cheering audience on Tiananmen Square, no more bullying from the outside world? And what makes this Communist Party such a success? Some liken it to, well, kind of a mix, an authoritarian state apparatus meets the Rotary Club. Members range from students to all the top business leaders, as well as fishermen, farmers. Here in the West, we've been raised on the notion that history aspires to a liberal democracy that someday the whole planet will embrace. Well, what about China then? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the centennial of the Chinese Communist Party. And with us from Oxford, historian and political scientist Rana Mitter, director of the University of Oxford China Center, your latest book, China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. Thank you for joining us.
Great pleasure to be here.
Jean-Paul Cheng is the founder of La Lettre de Chine, the China newsletter. Thank you for welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Welcome back as well to Taiwanese freelance reporter Ya-Chun Wang. How are you?
I'm great. Pleasure's all mine.
All right. Thank you for being with us. Chloé Froissart, a history and political science professor at INALCO, the National Institute of Languages and Oriental Civilizations here in Paris. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, #F24debate. It was a very different Shanghai where the Chinese Communist Party was founded 100 years ago. France 24 correspondent Charles Pellegrin made the trip.
With towering skyscrapers lining the riverbanks, Shanghai could be a shrine to capitalism. The metropolis is China's financial center and one of its economic engines. But it's also where the Chinese Communist Party was born 100 years ago. In this small house, where a dozen young idealists met in secret for their first Congress. Today, it's a museum, and for the ruling party's now 90 million members, one of the many holy sites of the People's Republic of China. People have come from all over the country to visit, often booking tickets several days in advance. The site was renovated and reopened in early June by Shanghai's party secretary Li Qiang. One of the main attractions is the first Chinese translations of Marx and Engels' Communist Manifesto. A few blocks away, where security allowed us to conduct interviews, visitors heaped praise on the party that has ruled China for the past 71 years.
They have led us into a new world. For me and for the country, the party has put us on a more prosperous path.
The Chinese Communist Party represents a renaissance for us in the world. It allows the Chinese people to be respected internationally.
The party represents my mother. Without her, I wouldn't be here. And without the party, I wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't have this wonderful life.
In the lead up to the anniversary, Beijing has been hard at work, pushing the party-approved version of history. Spearheading this effort is the Chinese Academy of History. It was created 2 years ago by Xi Jinping in an effort to counter negative views of the party's past. Movie theaters, for instance, have been ordered to screen and promote at least 2 propaganda movies every week. And new films like 1921 are being added to the canon of Chinese patriotic pictures. The action-packed historical drama tells the story of the foundation of the party. For those who saw this early screening, the movie has achieved its goals.
I feel very lucky to live in China today, and I have a great deal of gratitude to those revolutionary martyrs who sacrificed themselves.
But while boosting the official story, authorities are also censoring other narratives. A new hotline allows citizens to report any instance of historical nihilism, such as online comments that attack the party's ideology and leadership or defame national heroes or martyrs. Historians we reached out to in mainland China and Hong Kong either refused or didn't respond to our requests for an interview, but some are still willing to speak out. Wu Qiang is a political scientist who says he was dismissed from the prestigious Tsinghua University because of his work on Hong Kong's Occupy movement. Over time, he's seen how the party's history has changed according to who is in power. For instance, under the leadership of reformer Deng Xiaoping, the death and chaos of the Cultural Revolution were thoroughly examined and condemned. These criticisms have been erased.
The biggest change in this year's newly issued edition of the CCP's history is that it uses a nihilistic way to tell the story, especially for the part about the Cultural Revolution. It downplays the 10 years of disaster and turmoil brought by the Cultural Revolution in just 2 pages.
This particular revision of history suits Xi Jinping's tenure as leader, one defined by the lifting of term limits and a return to the kind of personality cult experienced during Mao Zedong's reign. For the party, it would seem the purpose of history isn't to uncover the truth about the past, but to consolidate power in the present.
So, Rana Mitter, no mention of the Cultural Revolution or the Great Leap Forward in Xi Jinping's speech at Tiananmen Square this Thursday. That's not a surprise. Rana, can you hear us? Rana Mitter, can you hear us? All right, we'll see. We'll try
Hello?
to... You can hear us now.
Hello.
Okay.
Hello, sorry, yes, I'm connected there. I think there was a glitch for a moment.
All right. No, I was just saying that no mention
So
of...
sorry, just
I was just saying no mention
Yes.
in the big speech by Xi Jinping on Tiananmen Square earlier of the Cultural Revolution, of the Great Leap Forward, and there was this positive sort of looking forward notion of what the last 100 years have been like for the party. That's not a surprise.
No, that's not a surprise at all. Essentially, in the last year or so, there have been huge numbers of warnings in official Chinese sources, endorsed very much from the top level, about what's called historical nihilism. In other words, the idea that China should not think about the Communist Party's history as the way that historians in most countries would do, which is that it has its ups and its downs, it has its complexities, it has its nuances. Instead, it's seen very much as a kind of historical inevitability, really a kind of classic Marxist view that the party starts as this gathering of 13 young men in Shanghai a century ago in 1921, and somehow there's a sort of inexorable path to the top 100 years later. And that means that all of the issues such as, I mean, you've mentioned the Great Leap Forward, this terrible economic experiment that went horribly wrong and killed tens of millions of people in the 1950s, that can't be mentioned at all. The Cultural Revolution, more complex. Certainly Xi Jinping didn't mention it. I wouldn't expect him to. But on the other hand, even where you can talk about it in guarded tones in China, you have to be very careful about what aspects you talk about, particularly, of course, not mentioning that this current top generation of leaders all grew up during that time, and their families probably had all sorts of connections with various of the Red Guard groups. So in other words, what we heard today was a sanitized version of history, not history with all the complexities and bumps that a historian would expect.
Was today about China over the last 100 years or about the Chinese Communist Party over the last 100 years?
Today was very much about the party because it's the 100th anniversary of the founding of that particular party. And the story is really about the party as what you might call a vehicle of destiny. In other words, the idea that until the Chinese Communist Party came along, China, that wider entity, was being buffeted by a whole variety of different factors. You could bring up foreign imperialism, the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century when the British and the French essentially forced the doors of China open. You could mention the mid-20th century when in World War II, Japan invaded China. Of course, China eventually fought back, but nonetheless, this was a time when China was vulnerable to the outside world. So in that sense, the party is being portrayed as the final vehicle of destiny that allowed China to stand up for itself. And that's why when you listen to Xi Jinping's speech today, he used quite martial language. The original Chinese is slightly different from the official translation. In fact, if you look at it, he really did talk about, kind of hitting and bashing the heads of those from outside countries who might attempt to actually try anything out on China. In other words, there's a very martial sort of language being used, and that's associated with the idea of the party as the entity that's supposed to stand up for the Chinese people and stand in the lead. That's the message they're trying to get over.
Yeah, we'll hear an excerpt of Xi Jinping in a moment, but first let's talk about that party today. 92 million members. It's still an exclusive club. 6.6% of the population have membership in the Communist Party in China. It often takes years of passing tests, garnering recommendations. The membership reflects a nation where citizens, you could say, are moving to the city. Here you see on this graph an increasing percentage are those that are university educated. Jean-Paul Chang, is the Communist Party becoming more elitist?
Oh, of course, yes, for some years already. And since Jiang Zemin's rule, when he decided that one of the historical mission is to develop the productive force in China, that means clearly that all those who contribute to develop the productive force in China are welcome in the party. That means entrepreneurs, engineers, inventors are welcome into the party. And since then, the 90s, you have a lot of university-graduated people coming to the party.
Does that upset the balance, though, of the Communist Party? If it's more and more, because we've seen here in France how parties from the left, like the socialists, when they became more elitist, they eventually collapse.
The organization is very unique in the world because the organization is so big with 95 million people now. In every field, every sector of the Chinese society, every profession, you have Communist parties cells among lawyers, among artists, among everything, writers, engineers, financier, and you have big stars of the high tech who are members of the party. So it's just playing a role of leaders, like in a kind of China Inc. You have this. Everything is targeted to the economic development, and you have all this apparatus of the party, which is just animating the country. So it's so intimately linked to the Chinese social life that I don't see right now the distanciation you are mentioning between the elite and the reality of the society.
And yet, Chloé Froissart, there is this sort of, you could say, a remnant perhaps of the days when it was an insurgency, and that members of the Chinese Communist Party don't discuss in public what they've been talking about at party meetings. There's a culture of secrecy. Why?
Wow. There's always been a culture of secrecy in the Communist Party history. I mean, this is a party which I think today is not at ease to celebrate its centenary, because there is obviously a big discrepancy between the initial ideals of the party as they were defined by Mao Zedong and what the party has become today. As Jean-Paul Chan just mentioned, there is obviously a big gap between the party and the common people. There is a big gap between the democracy that Mao Zedong promised to the Chinese people and the reality of the regime today. There is a lot of people who don't dare to speak out what they think about the party, and everything is made to make them identify with the party's successes and eventually with one leader. And we have seen in your video that you just showed at the beginning of this broadcast how everything was tailor-made to make the party, the people identify with the party and the leader. It was like kind of totalitarian choreography.
Okay, so Chloe, let me ask you then, why are there so many people who apply and candidacies that get rejected?
Because you can't do anything in China today if you're not member of the party, of the Communist Party. I mean, people apply out of careerism and opportunism rather than ideological conviction. And nobody holds like a powerful position in society in China today if he or she is not a member of the party. And it's a very, very difficult process, I mean, to become a member of the party, and very few peasants and workers can become a member, actually.
Jean-Paul Chang?
I believe the selection of members with all this possibility of rejection of a candidacy is based on the fact that the organization of the party is based on loyalty of its members, because they believe that's the criteria of efficiency. And that's why they are keeping practicing this. And by the way, I believe that the party, the original aim of the party, is to work in the interests of the people. And this is the slogan.
Well, let me quote in that case from Xi Jinping's speech. He said, "We solve the problem of absolute poverty, Yan Chunwan. We are striving towards the second centenary goal of building a modern and powerful socialist country in all respects." So solving the problem of absolute poverty, does that undermine the raison d'etre of an egalitarian premise of what, I mean, that's what a communist or party is, right? Egalitarianism above all.
Yeah, it's a good point that you made, but bear in mind that this is a speech that is towards domestic audience. And if you look at the reactions of the people when he said that line, people were exacerbating. And he is not wrong on an economic standpoint that the Communist Party had eradicated sort of, I would say 99% of the extreme poverty. But of course, the poverty line is still, it is still there, and there are still a huge population that living under poverty. But extreme poverty, let's say the ones that, for example, that the WHO just announced that malaria is now eradicated from China. All these diseases that fundamentally undermines a society has been slowly removing from the Chinese society. For example, that Xi Jinping, the speech is ensuring the people who are listening that we are moving towards a better future. You do not have to worry about us going backward, and therefore this is a promise for the people, and this is something that the people exactly want to hear.
And there's something else that they wanted to hear, and we'll talk about it when we come back, is what Rana Mitter was talking about, that martial tone when it comes to the outside world. You're watching the France 24 debate. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and it's the day when China has marked 100 years since the Communist Party was founded at a clandestine meeting in Shanghai in 1921. With us to talk about it from Oxford in England, Rana Mitter, director of the University of Oxford China Center. Your latest book, China's Good War, How World War II is Shaping a New Nationalism. Economist Jean-Paul Chang is with us, the founder of La Lettre de Chine, the China newsletter. And we're also in the company of Ya-Chun Wang, Taiwanese freelance reporter, and Chloé Froissart, history and political science professor at INALCO, the National Institute of Languages and Oriental Civilizations. Ya-Chun Wang, you were saying how you stumbled once into a Chinese Communist Party meeting?
Yes, I was, and this was back in 2018, and I was there to interview.
Where was this?
This was in Beijing. This was at the Family Planned Parenthood Institute of China. And I think they mistaken me as a prospective trainee, and therefore they invited me to a internal...
You say the meeting was bizarre. Why?
So bizarre, because there was absolutely nothing fruitful, per se. There was no update. There was nothing, new figures to show, so on. It was 7 veteran Communist Party members talking about the glorious day. There was a theme, the glorious past. And I think I was so bored that I just tried to write down how many times they have mentioned the glorious party, the duty as party member, and so on and so forth. And I think they mentioned at least 20, 30 times in the course of 2 hours, just talking about their missions back in the day and how that they will forever be loyal to the Communist Party.
Jean-Paul Cheng, she's not selling membership in the Communist Party. I'm not dreaming of it.
She didn't get it.
Unfortunately, I really try to cover it up.
All right, let's talk about what happened in that speech. That did get, that was rousing that we saw at Tiananmen Square earlier. The loudest cheers during Xi Jinping's Centenary Day speech came when he expanded on the, quote, great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation entering an irreversible historical course.
The Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully, oppress, or enslave them. Anyone trying to do so will most certainly face bloodshed in front of a great wall of steel built by more than 1.4 billion Chinese.
You weren't kidding, Rana Mitra. Those are pretty harsh words. Who is he talking about?
He's talking about the many forces that he sees emerging outside China that, in his view, mean China no good whatsoever. Of course, the United States is part of that mixture, maybe at the head of the pack. And I think there's worry about that on the grounds that when President Trump was still in power until a few months ago, at least he wasn't bringing that many people along with him, at least openly. Whereas now that President Biden is in office, he's doing a pretty good job at getting allies to come along with him. So you might say that it was aimed in a sense at the G7 meeting of the 7, major economic democracies that came together in the UK just a few weeks ago. They talked about China very openly, very explicitly, said they wanted to push back against initiatives like China's Belt and Road Initiative, this big economic infrastructure project. And Xi Jinping is using this speech to remind the world that, of course, the Chinese Communist Party also has this long history as a party that believes, in the words of Chairman Mao himself in one of his early writings, power grows out of the barrel of a gun. So I think this is actually quite an unusual speech, because it's very unusual for Chinese leaders to use that kind of martial military language directly in front of that audience. And that makes it, I think, a bit of a historical turning point, actually.
A bit of a historical turning point, and it didn't stop there. Just to tell our viewers, to be complete, in Hong Kong, there was also a centenary ceremony. It was under close watch. The speeches were in Mandarin, not Cantonese. Police deployed in large numbers just in case. There were 11 arrests in the Mong Kok district for those allegedly distributing seditious leaflets. Now, in his speech, Xi Jinping talked of Beijing's consolidation of overall control over Hong Kong, which we've been reporting on, and the sister autonomous territory of Macau. And in the name of national security, he says, and in the name of national security, he then set his sights on Taiwan.
All of us, including our compatriots across the Taiwan Strait, must come together and be united in moving forward. We must take resolute action to utterly defeat any attempt towards Taiwanese independence and work together for a bright future for our national rejuvenation. No one should underestimate the resolve, the will, and the ability of the Chinese people to defend their national sovereignty and territorial integrity.
Yachun Wang, does that mean that that day we've been talking about for decades, when China would invade Taiwan, is coming sooner rather than later?
I think we must bear in mind that this is far from the first time that Xi Jinping said something along the line and using such strong words. So I do not think that this indicate.
How are those words received in Taipei?
Not well, as always. Nothing is well received in Taipei, and of course, our government respond in the usual way as well, that we're going to stand our ground, and we refuse any military agitations from the other side of the Strait. But this being said, I think he's more saying this to a wider audience as well, the international audience, because if military action does happen on the Taiwan Strait, it's not only between the two, of course. Why we have been worrying about it for so long is that the US and Japan will most likely have to be involved. And what does that mean for the NATOs? What does that mean for Australia? And what does that mean for Singapore, for the Korean Peninsula? And how will Russia respond to all of this when NATO starts to act? All of this is a huge chain effect. And this is the reason why I think there should be a deeper note into his speech, but not just taking it as we're going to invade Taiwan tomorrow. But this speech, General, has been using a very harsh tone. And I think this harsh tone comes from the fact that they are able to do what they say. And this is probably the most scary part, because they have, maybe in the past, maybe a decade ago, maybe 15 years ago, we could have said, okay, we'll put this off and analyze it further, but ever more possible that China is able to act on their words.
Or it could be a reaction to what we're witnessing. You heard Rana Mitter talk about how Joe Biden has rallied G7 members. We've talked about the UK's commitment to send a fleet to the Pacific. Now the Financial Times reports in its cover story that for more than a year, that's before Biden came to office, the US and Japan have been conducting war games and joint exercises to prepare for an eventual conflict with China over Taiwan. Joint exercises in the South China Seas that had been couched as a disaster relief training. They've also held more military exercises around the Senkaku Islands, which are disputed and which the Chinese call the Diaoyu, and which lie just 350 kilometers, you can see on this map, west of Taiwan. So you heard Ya Chun-wan saying, it's probably not coming to a head right now, but the strong words of Xi Jinping, is it have to do with the fact that
I believe his tone, in spite of the fact that he used a very strong word, talking about to resist to all these people who want to bully, oppress, attack China, etc. About Taiwan, his tone was quite moderate, because he mentioned the peaceful reunification efforts. Of course, he adds something about the struggle against the partisans of independence of Taiwan, but somehow he's using a tone well below the academic discussions on both sides of the strait about the military operation. So I believe that we should not give too much importance to this celebration speech after all. And he's just reminding everybody about the legitimacy, historical legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party as the representative of the Chinese pride, the Chinese national pride, and the national interest somehow. And, you know, Communist Party is here to protect the Chinese sovereignty, the Chinese people, etc. So it's normal that in a celebration speech, he said that. Just to come back to another point, you said that he didn't mention the Great Leap Forward, etc. It's not completely true. Of course, they didn't put the subject explicitly, but in all the speech, when they said somewhere that the Communist Party is able in its governance to correct its own mistake and to change the course to find the right way, actually they accepted implicitly that they made mistake and grave mistakes and took wrong pace in the past.
Chloé Froissart, so you heard Rana Mitter describing this speech as a possible turning point. You heard Jean-Paul Chang saying this is normal, this is for this kind of occasion, the rhetoric you will hear. What do you think?
Well, I think that Xi Jinping has no way to convince the Taiwan people to that the so-called principle of one country, two system that he wants to apply on Taiwan as well will be like a solution, a workable solution for them. And I think that obviously, I mean, Taiwanese people cherish their independence and their democracy, and that if Xi wants really to reunify Taiwan with the motherland, then it will be quite difficult to achieve it without using the military force. Of course, China doesn't have like an interest of using military force. It could potentially lead to the Third World War, but who knows? I mean, Xi Jinping is. Everything might be possible for him, you know.
Let me bring in Rana Mitter on this, because when we saw the protests in 2019 in Hong Kong, many panelists on this show said, Beijing's going to want to preserve the one country, two systems because it needs Hong Kong as the world's third financial center. Well, now we know the answer, that, point of fact, they're moving away from that. When it comes to Taiwan, the future, is it as unwritten as it was with Hong Kong?
I think it's a different sort of problem. The issue with Hong Kong, just to say briefly, was, of course, that it had gone back to Chinese sovereignty by 1997. And that means that actually the fate of Hong Kong was always in Beijing's hands from that point onward. I, too, was surprised by how quickly they've shut the city down, which essentially is close to what's happened. But they always had the power to do it. Taiwan is not the same. There are both strategic and there are political reasons why it's difficult. Strategic reasons are that most military observers who look at what it would take to actually take Taiwan by military strength would say that even now, for China's beefed up armed forces, it would still take a lot of efforts and not necessarily guarantee to succeed. So that's one problem. But the wider problem is going back to what we said before about President Biden. I think that it's very clear that signals are being sent to the government in Beijing that it wouldn't just be the United States that would be very much, on guard if there was any attempt to try and take Taiwan by force. Japan would see it as an existential threat, I think, in many ways, and so would many of the American allies in the region, of which there are a large number. Whereas apart from North Korea, China doesn't really have any formally allied partners in the region at all. So I think if we're looking at what may happen with Taiwan, just to make a prediction, I think there'll be much more economic pressure than there is now. A lot of supply chains for major Taiwan companies, Foxconn, the tech company, would be an example of that, are dependent on contacts with the mainland, and seeing China try and push on those economic levers is something that we'll see more of, not least since they've used economic levers against South Korea, against Australia and other countries recently. The difficulty, I think, is doing it with the people who Xi Jinping himself called compatriots in that speech. You don't really you may crush your enemy's windpipe. It looks much worse to crush your compatriots' windpipe, whether it's economically, military, or in any other way.
Yeah, Chun Wang?
Yeah, I would just like to add that I do agree with the fact that I think the economic pressure is going to be far more realistic for the Taiwanese people than, let's say, the military threats.
But you heard Rana Mitter, for instance, mentioning Foxconn, that company that makes key components for companies like Apple. Why is it? I mean, it's in nobody's interest, right, to shut down a company like that, right?
No,
Don't both sides stand to gain?
No, absolutely not. And if you wanted to name TSMC as well, the chip maker is also at stake. But if you think about it, I would say that there are two generations of Taiwanese people now living. The ones that have built all these tech tycoons, and these are the ones that see business interests as a very solid foundation of Taiwan very seriously. And then there is a younger generation that has all the passion and all the ingrown hatred against the mainland China. And China knows that it is these older generation that is sort of consolidifying the power of Taiwan right now. And to have their heart at the moment is very important for China. And then the problem that they want to deal later on perhaps is the younger generations that has no economic power over the Taiwanese island. And then perhaps that's also a lesser problem for them. And if you want to speak about Foxconn, they have lots of factory in China as well. TSMC as well, a lot of factory actually in US. They're not worried about, let's say, military invasion per se. They do not wish this to happen. But if the attack does happen, the loss would not be tremendous or unrecoverable.
All right, before we finish, let's go around the room once, because again, it's this milestone moment, 100 years of a party, and we've been wondering what the next 100 years look like. We remember 3 decades ago, we were wondering, after Deng Xiaoping had opened up the economy, whether, as the French say, capitalism was soluble in communism. It turns out it is, by the looks of it, with China set to eventually become the world's top economy. We have put a poll on our YouTube channel and on the hashtag F24Debate. What will it look like in 100 years' time? And well, so far, you're saying 54% that it will be the same model. 20% say China will move more towards democracy, and 26% some other kind of authoritarian state. Jean-Paul Chang, like me, you have a bit of gray hair around the temples. So you remember when China opened up. How does the future look at this particular time for this Chinese model?
I don't see yet any disruptive factors in the present political and economic governance.
One taboo's been broken, right? Because you have, for the first time since Mao, a leader who could be there potentially for life.
No, I don't think so. I mean, this is a misinterpretation, following my personal opinion.
Well, he's certainly broken the taboo on 2 terms.
We can always caricature Mr. Xi Jinping as a lifelong leader, etc. The truth is more complex. I mean, the political message behind the fact that he said the rule of 2 mandates is over is vis-à-vis his enemies in China. All this group of interest, I mean, touched by the anti-corruption campaign, because all these people were saying, okay, just wait for 5 more years and then we'll come back again. And his message by suppressing this rule is saying, okay, don't imagine that it's over. When I start something, I will go on.
Chloé Froissart, what's more important in 2021, the party or Xi Jinping?
Well, both. No, but definitely, I mean, Xi Jinping wants to occupy the place that Mao used to occupy, 40 years ago. So I don't know. I think the most important today is what will happen when Xi Jinping will not be able to hold on power anymore. And maybe the key question is this question of succession. I mean, how to pass on the power. And this is one of the main vulnerability of the regime today, because Deng Xiaoping was very clever and he tried to plan his own succession and the succession of his successor. Xi Jinping not only didn't plan any successor, but he made himself emperor for life. So he's not eternal, obviously. So what will happen when he will die? So this is the big uncertainty. But it's not necessary that China will democratize, even though I think that many critics may raise at this occasion, but obviously, a lot of liberal intellectual and reformers have left abroad, especially in the U.S., and many of the so-called Democrats remaining in China equate democracy with Trump. So.
So let me put it to Rana Mitter, because we're running short on time. Is China weaker or stronger without dissent?
I think it's weaker without dissent, but actually there's always been a cycle. Oh, sorry, was that for me?
Yes, go ahead.
I think it's always weaker without dissent, but actually over the last 50 years or so, China has gone from periods when it's been relatively more liberal, even 10 years ago under Jiang Zemin, when there was quite a lot of political criticism on social media, there was a relatively freer press, to right now where it is much more buttoned down. But we need to look to the next generation. Just a quick answer also to follow on how things are going to change. Never mind 100 years from now. Think about 10 years from now, when China's demographics are changing rapidly because of the one-child policy's aftermath. In fact, from that time, there'll be 5 million fewer Chinese every year. The ones that are left are going to be older, they're going to need pensions, they're going to need healthcare. The problems facing the Chinese Communist Party are going to be very different from the problems of a younger society, regardless of who is leader, Xi Jinping or anyone else. So do look at the long-term effects that go beyond any one leader to understand how China's leading party will have to change, and actually within a decade or two, not even within a century.
Rana Mitter, I want to thank you so much for joining us from Oxford. I want to thank as well Chloé Froissart, Jean-Paul Cheng, Yan-Chun Wang for being with us as well. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.